Hi, this is Tracy Tokuhama-Espinosa, and today we're going to look at the concept of emotional intelligence and where it comes from. If you recall, last week we talked about how emotional intelligence was actually born of some ideas maybe way as far back as Darwin, but they were really made more popular in the 1980s, 1990s by people like Daniel Goleman. Well, today we want to look at this idea of what is the real definition of emotional intelligence, what are some of the models, and what tests of emotional intelligence actually exist, and then make sure that we understand that emotional intelligence is not the same as multiple intelligence, and emotional intelligence is not necessarily social cognition, so we can clarify those terms at the end, and then hopefully leave a space for questions. Emotions. Okay, so remember we talked about emotions being something that impulses you to take action, right? So we understand that we can interpret this in physiological, psychological, and behavioral levels. The word intelligence, so emotional intelligence, so if emotion means to move or impulse somebody towards action, there's a lot of different definitions that we have out here. The real hardcore one that comes from Latin basically means the one who knows how to choose, which is very interesting if you look back at what we talked about last week. In that there is no decision without emotions. So we see now there's a really clear connection here between general intelligence and emotions. Other definitions are related to the ability to understand or the ability to resolve problems. And we know that it's very heavily reliant on sense perception as well as memory. So we also see that intelligence is a general mental capacity that implies being able to reason, plan, resolve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, and learn really quickly or learn from habituated experience. So there's a lot of ways to approach this definition, and we know that there's things like street smarts versus being innately intelligent in something or being gifted, right? So we have this big spectrum of ideas to consider when we look at a definition of intelligence. All of these, by the way, come from the American Psychological Association and their definitions of intelligence. We also know that intelligence differs greatly based on an individual's past experience, right? And so how they are able to react and adapt to their environment and to the things that actually happen to them in their daily lives. So each new learning helps you build upon future learning, which is why the more you know, the more you can know, right? And we also look at intelligence as being a way of organizing and understanding your world, the way you can actually categorize and structure the world around you. So verbs that we have related to the word intelligence have to do with being adaptable or being able to learn or to comprehend, create, identify, understand, memorize, think, perceive, plan, reason, reflect, resolve, know, or overcome obstacles. And the words that are associated typically with emotions, you might run up your own list, but some words that come to mind are feeling, perceiving, disquiet, reaction, pleasure, alarms. Different people will use the word emotions in different types of ways. So if we have all of this huge package of ideas connected with emotions and connected with intelligence, what are some of these or emotional theories? You know, Jung placed these things on this kind of a spectrum, which is kind of interesting to know that love is the opposite of hate, right? Aggression is very different from wonder. Remember I challenged you last week to think about exactly how you would lay out if you could list all the emotions that come to your mind right now, then what kind of a spectrum, what kind of a visual could you offer us for those? I mean, are those things that are they a linear concept? Are they circular like this? Are they like Takanishi's cube that we had before? There's a lot of different ways to consider the structure of emotions. When we consider emotional intelligence, however, there's really just four parameters that we're looking at. And one has to do with the self, an individual, me, myself, right? And then being able to understand what do I feel, and then being able to manage what I do, okay? Manage those feelings. I feel this is how I'm reacting. And then the second scale has to do with actually understanding the other, being able to perceive emotions in other people. I can see what this person is feeling. I can see he's sad. I can see she's worried, okay? And then how do I manage that, okay? So they have to do with this scale of first being able to interpret and understand, and then being able to do something about it, to manage it. And from the scale of the individual that's at hand, one is myself, and then the others, okay? So this is the basic concept of emotional intelligence. In Goleman's model, he actually lays out 6 different building blocks for this, and he says that to be able to really consider yourself emotionally intelligent, you have to have an elevated level of self-awareness, right? To be able to understand what is it that you're feeling, right? Self-regulation means how to manage yourself. And then the social skills to interpret others' feelings, as well as empathy to feel what they might be feeling. Then you also have to have motivation to be able to react in an appropriate way, and then to those individuals. And then that leads to your ability then to come to a superior decision-making level. And if you recall last week, we spent a lot of time talking about the connection between emotions and decision-making. So the idea is if you can have all of these building blocks in place, then you're able to make better decisions in your life. There's a keep it simple, stupid model. There's a KISS model, which is basically what we said before. There's myself, and then there's the others, and then there's being able to understand or recognize that emotion and being able to manage it. So there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different pictures. Some people break them down into more elements than others, all of the sub-elements. So you can actually look at, for example, to regulate your emotion, you have to be able to do this in yourself and in others, but this means through nonverbal perception of how somebody is reacting. Remember we talked last week about how people interpret really quickly facial expressions, even though they're not conscious that they're interpreting that. But then you also have to understand in the other how to feel empathy towards that other person and what they might be experiencing and why. So what are some of the models of emotional intelligence that exist out there? We have, again, this whole thing of myself and the other, being self-aware, self-management, and then the other, empathy, and actually managing other people's emotions. So there's several different models that exist out there. One of the most important in my mind, mainly because it's been around for a long time and well substantiated and continually developed over the years, is Salovey and Meyer's model, which proposes that emotional intelligence is the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and to discriminate among them and to use that information then to take proper action, right? To be able to behave or to react in the correct way. So they break this down in a slightly different way from Goleman. They say that you have to perceive emotions, which is similar to Goleman, but then you have to use those emotions. You have to be able to harness that in order to get something else, right? So it's not only being able to interpret and react appropriately to emotions, but it's being able to use emotional states of others, which is kind of, sounds a teeny bit manipulative, but the idea is actually in the positive. It's being able to, it's not only saying, oh, when he's vulnerable, I'm going to take advantage of him. No, it's basically saying that, this is knowing to, when you're asking dad for $10, to go out, when is he in the right mood to do that, right? So there's this actual use of emotional states of others. And then there's understanding of the other person's emotions, which is similar to Goleman's model, and to manage them as well. So in this sense, you have this self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills that are necessary. They're defined in these ways, and then you can actually see what this means. So a person who has an element of emotional intelligence, which is being self-aware, you can actually see that this person shows self-confidence. They're realistic in their self-assessments. They don't think they're better or worse than what they really are. And they have a self-depreciating sense of humor. They can actually make fun of themselves because, they got nothing to lose, because they're just so cool in their skin, as we say in California, right? They're just so self-aware that they don't have any problems with joking about who they are because they know who they are. In terms of self-regulation, these are people who really show a high level of trustworthiness, integrity. They don't mind having things that are ambiguous, so they don't worry that they don't know everything, right? And they're open to these ideas of change. So self-regulation means that you're able to go with the flow, right? You can manage these things in different ways. Motivation is another hallmark of emotional intelligence. It's not that you just receive this information, but you know then how to move this to action. So these are people who have a strong desire to achieve. They're very optimistic about their ability to face, difficulties, and they are committed, to these types of changes. So these are great hallmarks of emotional intelligence, as is empathy, your ability to sense what others are feeling. And finally, having social skills and the ability to react is also a huge part of emotional intelligence. Not only reacting or feeling what the other feels, being empathetic towards that person, but also, using that information to lead to positive change. And this is what a lot of people who work in psychology do when they guide their patients, right? It's also a part of being persuasive, instigating the correct change based on the emotional states of others. And this has a lot to do with the way people can actually lead others or lead other groups. So with this kind of background information, which a lot of the different models share, we can look at some of those specific models that actually exist out there. And so this one comes from the multi-health systems interpretation of models of emotional intelligence. They have to do with actually outcomes, right? So emotional and social functioning, being able to perform well, social engagement levels are what happens when things work well, right? So then you have well-being of the individual. And so if you're able to manage stress, if you have good self-perception, if you're able to express yourself well, good interpersonal relationships, then all of these things link in the emotional sense to being able to making good decisions, right? And what are some of the skill sets that are necessary? You have problem solving, flexibility, self-regard, emotional expression, assertiveness, empathy. At the core of this is basically emotional intelligence. And so this is one model. Goleman's model, as we mentioned before, had those 6 different elements. Then you have some other very simple models that look at just empathy, assertiveness, impulse control, and optimism. This is like a really simplistic view of emotional intelligence. Others have to do with different competencies levels, which they break down even further. And these have to do with some corporate models of emotional intelligence, basically with a different kind of a goal in mind, right? That we're actually trying to satisfy a customer, we're trying to sell more things. It's a different view of how you can actually leverage some of the information in emotional intelligence. One of the ones I like a lot, this one I like just mainly, it's heavily detailed, and so some people like to shy away from this because they don't like too much information here. But it's the same thing we talked about before, right? This is the me, this is the other, this is can I be aware of myself, and then what does that mean, and then how can I do this with other people, right? So if you can get those, if you get your head around these things, I think there's a lot of examples in this particular model which are kind of helpful. Once we began to accept that emotional intelligence was real, even though it was not as tangible and easy to measure as some other things that were coming out as far as traditional intelligence tests, there were some great attempts to actually come up with tools. Now, how do we know if somebody is highly emotionally intelligent? Because we know that this has great spin-off effects for society. If we have more people who are emotionally intelligent, we have less conflicts, we have more people who can get along well, and so it's positive, right? We want people who are emotionally intelligent. But how do we know if we've got them? So how do we measure this? So some of the models that came out, one of the ones I mentioned before had to do with Meyer and Salovey's work. They posed a lot of really interesting questions themselves when they were trying to come up with tools. They said, is it possible to be wrong when you answer an emotional intelligence test? Or is what you're trying to get out is basically on a scale of things, where are people falling, so that you can actually figure out where strengths are and where weaknesses are, not saying they are or are not emotionally intelligent. So what they came up with is a multi-factor emotional intelligence scale that had 12 different tasks involved in them. And these tasks had to do with meta-processing, abstraction, abstract understanding, knowledge-based processing, input processing, among other things. So if you're interested in looking at their test, you can actually find that online. It's interesting. It's a good way to get, I would say, like any other test or any other measurement that's trying to assess an individual, and humans are just so complex that a single measure is not going to do it. I think you really have to look for things at multiple lenses on the same individual, and before you can actually make some generalizations. But it's a good one to look at. Another test that was developed was the Byron Emotional Quotient Intelligence Test, which is very, very interesting, which has to do with looking at different aspects of emotional intelligence and wondering how people reacted to situational models of those different situations. So according to this model, emotional social intelligence is a cross-section of interrelated emotion and social competencies, skills, facilitators that determine how effectively we understand and express ourselves, understand others, and relate to them and cope with daily demands, okay? And that, if you look at their paper that's listed down here from 2006, you can actually see a sample in their annex of this particular model. It basically has 133 different types of items. They're short sentences. People have to respond to them. They also use a Likert scale to see at what stage people are at. Because similar to Meyer and Salovey, they don't say that you have emotional intelligence or you don't, or you're high or you're low. They basically have these gradient scales that help you understand where people are stronger or weaker. They don't say, I mean, apparently they all presume that everybody has some level of emotional intelligence, but what they're trying to show is where they're stronger or where they're weaker. So one of the most simple and very intriguing tests, I would say, over the past couple decades has to do with the marshmallow test. A great new book is out on this. It came out in 2014. Highly recommended.